Hello, welcome back to Energetically You. I'm your host, Megan Swan. I am a wellness and mindset coach specializing in helping powerful women doing peak performance keep going and have more natural energy than they ever thought before. I focus on nutrition, mindfulness, and honoring our biorhythms and sleep cycles. Today, I have the pleasure of chatting with Megan Sweet, another Megan. She is an expert in leading community driven education transformation in high need schools and districts. With more than 25 years of experience in education and 15 years directly leading changes in schools, districts, and statewide in California, she knows that education is the most important lever we have for creating a more equitable society. She also knows that the best way to realize true change is by supporting and empowering individuals to lead the changes they envision for their school communities. Today, we are going to talk about a process she has developed to take better care of yourself while also being more effective at work. She will also share with us how she failed to take her own advice and burned out again, and what she has learned from that experience. So let's dive in. Welcome, Megan. How are you this morning?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, it's early here, but it's nice outside in California.
Nice. I'm dreaming of traveling again internationally, but we can get into that later. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your extensive experience in leadership and education?
Yeah, sure. So I started out in education at 21 as a teacher, and I taught for 10 years. And one of the things I noticed really early on in my teaching career was that there were a lot of inequities that were in our society that were showing up in my classroom. And I left teaching after 10 years to become an administrator, because I felt like my reach and my ability to create change that would actually impact the students that I was serving would be greater if I was in an administrative position. So I went back to school and I got my doctoral degree in educational leadership with a focus on education finance reform and change management. And I know that sounds really exciting. And most people at this point usually start backing away from me really slowly. But
But so essential, I mean, to the solution.
even educators are like, nope, I'm out. So, what I really studied was how do we use funds in a way that can support students? So how can we be effective in our planning, and how does economics impact our ability to be successful in the future? And ever since then, I've been working on change management. So I was a school turnaround leader, which means I went to a failing school and helped to redesign it. And we were really successful. And it went from the lowest performing school in the district to now one of our premier schools. And it was pretty quick change. And then I've been leading those changes in districts and county offices or in counties and even across the state of California for the last 15 years. Some related to the money stuff that I studied, but some of it just related to identifying and implementing changes. So that's my favorite thing to do. And I do it a lot. So we have a lot of change in education.
Well, I can imagine it's extremely rewarding work, but also very heavy at times and something you need to protect yourself against in terms of burnout, you and all of the teachers. Is that something that you integrate into your work when you approach a new school?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Actually, it's what led me to my approach around education change, which is this burnout factor. So I am somebody who likes to create change and I understand change, but change, even when it's positive, And something that we want often comes with a lot of feelings of overwhelm, anxiety, aggression sometimes. And I've been in a position, as are a lot of public education teachers or administrators, in a position of actually trying to do a lot with very little, with a lot of competing demands and priorities. And so you're kind of always feeling like you're on shifting sands.
Mhm.
Sometimes really hard to get our bearing, and to feel like we're being effective. And that was certainly true for me. Certainly, excuse me, certainly true for a lot of the educators that I supported and continue to support, because it's really hard. And the pandemic brought that out, for sure, even 10 times more than what was true before. I mean, for educators, they've had to change every single approach to how they do their job overnight to be able to accommodate the shelter in place that we've had over the last year and a half. So for me, as somebody who led change, so for somebody who is a part of a lot of changes and supporting a lot of leaders, what I started to notice was that we didn't have a lot of tools for adapting to that and working with that. And I was noticing the impact on myself. So I was getting increasingly anxious, increasingly overwhelmed with the idea of going in and providing change management stuff to schools, because it is a lot of emotional overload and a lot of, you take on a lot when you're in those spaces. So I started working on it for myself first. So that's where I began, which was, okay, what do I need to do to feel better so that I can go into these spaces and have the energy and the reserves I need to be able to do this and not feel burned out and kind of beaten up all the time. So I started integrating mindfulness practices into my own life, which I'd already been doing mindfulness for a long time, but I started bringing it into my workday. So I would meditate a little bit. I visited a lot of schools, so I would start meditating even 5 minutes in the car in between school sessions, or I would take like mindful breaths in the middle of stressful meetings, and do a few other things to start seeing if that helped me feel better. And I noticed two things. One is I felt better. So it worked. I felt a little bit more grounded and stable, but also my interactions with others changed. I didn't have to do anything else. I didn't have to make them do mindful breaths, but because I was being more mindful and more grounded, my interactions with all of those folks was more mindful and grounded too. I think some of which is like how I interacted with them, but also I think something about my energy helped them to calm down also. And so I started researching how I could bring that to other educators. And so that's a lot of what I do now.
Awesome. And so is it something you teach, or how do you uh, encourage them to consider it without being authoritarian about it, which is kind of counterproductive to mindfulness?
Right. I do it a few different ways. So I wrote a book that talks about it. So my book is an educator's guide for using your three eyes. And what that talks about is how to do what I actually call self-work, which is developing a heartful and kind relationship with yourself. It has a lot of mindfulness practices in it, alongside doing the schoolwork. So educators are mission-driven people. They don't want to, we often don't feel like we have the time to stop, but B, we don't often want to stop and take care of ourselves. So I wanted to be able to create a system that people could do while they were doing their jobs. So that's outlined in my book. And it really is just an invitation. And I give a lot of talks about mindfulness and education, and actually help to create a full program around bringing mindfulness into education that's also grounded in equity and diversity and inclusion. So mostly what I do is just an invitation and I demystify, right? So I think when we think about mindfulness or meditation, people imagine a monk sitting off on a mountaintop somewhere, very isolated and separate from the world. So I try as much as possible to help educators see, and anybody see, how mindfulness is something that we can integrate into our daily life all the time in really simple and easy ways. We don't need to jump to meditating 30 minutes a day or doing any of these things that I think often stop people from starting a practice like that. So I just try and make it feel really accessible. And it's an invitation. I have plenty of science and research that I can use to back that up, because sometimes it also helps educators to feel more confident in doing something like that. And so I share that when needed.
I bet that helps. I love that word, demystify. And I totally agree. I mean, with most of my clients, if I sense some resistance to any new habit I'm suggesting. It's like, okay, well, just 2 minutes. Let's just try it 2 minutes a
Yep.
day. If after a week you see no difference, well, then that's one thing. But I love how you integrate several pauses throughout your day, because I'm sure that's probably even more effective, that you're taking the pause in even within a meeting. Is that what I understood? What would
Yeah,
that
I
look
mean,
like?
yeah, what does that look like? It looks a couple different ways. So the pauses, I think, are really one of the biggest ways that I try and encourage educators to start integrating mindfulness in. And I say, actually, it starts with a decision to commit to taking care of yourself a little bit more.
Mm.
So, and that can look any way that we want to as individuals, that what taking care of ourselves looks like. So, but when we make that commitment and we start trying to find even these few seconds to fill it into our day, it actually starts to shift. And I'm sure you know this, it shifts how we think about ourselves and how we approach the world, but also taking care of ourselves. So the first invitation is just to commit to taking care of yourself a little bit and trying it out. And then the second is just to talk about different ways to do that. So, I mean, I'm a single mom, so sometimes my self-care is just spending a few extra minutes in the bathroom where I can't be like, I get to be alone for a minute, or an extra shower, extra few minutes in the shower. It could be things like I don't look at my phone at stoplights anymore. I used to be so go, go, go that at the stoplights I was getting in a few extra text messages, and that ramped up energy is really hard. Choosing to stop and breathe for a few minutes in between my transitions. But in meetings, there's lots of ways to do it. And actually, I offer this to teachers a lot because it's something they can do in their classroom, which is what's called like a 3-breath micro practice. So really tiny practice. So the 3-breath micro practice really just starts with the first breath is just remembering that we're breathing. How often do we even forget that we're breathing during the day? So just connecting in with this, okay, I'm breathing. The second breath is an invitation just to check in with our bodies and see, as we're breathing in and then breathing out, where are we tense and where can we just soften that energy a little bit, especially when we're in agitated situations, or we're in like hectic classrooms, we're clenched in some way, and that also leads us to not being super open. So
Mhm.
where are we tense and where can we soften that a little bit? And the third is just to ask myself and remind myself what's most important for me right now. We as humans spend so much time either thinking about the future or ruminating on the past
Mhm.
that we very rarely are in the present moment, and we can lose sight of what's most important for us in this moment in time. So it could be keeping the classroom safe. It could be, for me, I spend most of my life in meetings. It could be whatever I'm hoping to get out of that meeting or how I want to show up in that meeting. If I'm with stressful people, often my agenda, the main thing that I want to do is to come across as open and collaborative, or to stay open and to listen. So I ask myself what that is and remind myself what that is, and let that go as well. So that's the 3 breaths. It takes 30 seconds, not very long. And that's something generally we can do in meetings. Often in meetings or in classroom settings, there's that much time anyway. And that makes a big difference in terms of how I show up. A more involved practice, which I also do in those same moments, is starting to work with my own limiting beliefs or the things that I know get in my way, which requires that we get a little bit curious about ourselves. But when we start to take care of ourselves a little bit, we start to be more mindful. We start to get information about how we're thinking and how we're interacting with others, right? And it can be hard to face that, but if we can open the door to that, then that information is there. And once we know how we're reacting to certain people or certain situations, then we can also start to adjust our responses within those same moments. So for me, for example, I noticed I did a practice where for a week I would jot down all the thoughts that were in my head when I was in meetings. Not all of them, but when I would remember, I would jot them down. And if I could, I attached an emotion to it. And if I could, I attached like a bodily sensation to it, but I didn't put a lot of pressure on myself. But I just carried this notebook around for a week.
Mhm.
And then I went back and I looked at the data. And I'm a pretty self-aware person, and I thought I had a good handle on things. But what was so profound was consistently, and I mean like 90% of the time, I was having worries about how people were responding to the things that I was saying. Like 90% of the time, I was assessing people's response to me and whether or not what I had said was landing well or not well. And that was a really huge insight to have, because I was like, oh, okay, if I'm that worried all the time about how I'm saying things, then how is it that I'm expressing things? And what I noticed was, like, because it was hard, because I was fearful, sometimes when I would say things, it had a little bit more edge to it, because it just took that much effort for me to get it out. So I started like working with that and just speaking a little bit sooner and a little bit more often. And noticed if I had that edge, I would write it down before I said it out loud, just to make sure that I could say it in the way that felt the most clear for me. And then I work with like letting go of what I thought people thought about me. Like, okay, is that my business? Nope. Most of the time, it's not my business what people think about me. So I went through a few different practices with that, and that's still something that I notice. But again, in those same meetings, I just started to notice that inner dialogue and was able to address it in the moment rather than allowing it to start to drive how I was showing up. So those are some examples of what I do and what I encourage folks to do.
Wow, that's a really powerful exercise you did, and I love your insight. Can you, because I mean, part of your job is also to clearly communicate and influence people, I'm sure, right? So how or what was the work for you to sort of just build your confidence and deliver those messages, like you say, maybe from like a softer delivery or point of view, versus, because on some level you need them to be on board, right?
I did a couple of things. One is I identified some allies in my spaces that could give me what I would trust would be honest feedback. So so I let some colleagues know, look, I've noticed that, I'm having some anxiety about talking. I'm worried that I'm having this impact. Can you give me some feedback after the meetings about whether or not, because when we're so stuck in our head and we have these powerful beliefs, it's also really hard to be clear. So I wanted to identify some people that would help me to do that. So I call those folks our believing eyes, or which actually comes from Sonia Choquette, who's a spiritual teacher. But what she says, and what I think is true, is when we are trying to make a change, we should identify people that really believe in us and who want us to be successful and are going to encourage us. They help us to kind of focus our attention on something different. So I cultivated some believing eyes in my workspaces who I knew would give me positive feedback, but also give me real feedback. So I knew that they wanted me to be successful. They were cheering me on. And if they gave me feedback, it was because they wanted me to be better rather than anything else. So that really helped a lot. The other thing was I started to pay attention to what people were saying to me about me. So beyond those believing eyes, I started just like noticing how the responses were. So if I had this like big, heavy like thought of like, oh my gosh, I mean, I literally was writing down things like I might get fired for saying this. These are the kinds of like highly anxious things that I was thinking. But then I would respond. And so when those thoughts would come up, I'd be like, okay, have I ever been fired for anything that I've said? Nope. So, okay, maybe I can let that go. And have I ever, lost my ability to work effectively with anybody that I've been with because of anything that I've said? Not most of the time, sometimes, but often when I dove into those, it was, I was telling folks hard truths, or I was having to hold the line on something that was just true, and that I couldn't necessarily change. And if I had done harm, I started actually also reaching out to those folks and connecting. Like if I felt like I had said something that landed wrongly with someone, I would just talk with them, be like, hey, just wanted to follow up after that meeting. How did that go for you? How did that feel? And through all those things, I started to kind of undo that fear. And it started just to not like guide me anymore, but my communication started to change because I was getting some feedback on how things landed or didn't land. I think I can use very definitive language, which is some of the feedback that I got. So I've learned to use some softer language that doesn't feel quite so like strong. But also I now also know when I start to feel set up and when those moments start to happen, and I try and avoid them when I can. And sometimes I can't. And when that happens, and when I communicate in a way that I don't necessarily like, or it doesn't land the way I'd hoped it would, then I just try and treat myself with a lot of self-compassion and keep it stepping, because it's already over. So all I can do is either repair or move on. So I've also stopped a lot of that rumination, which has helped me just to feel more clear generally.
Wow. So basically, you've done some really deep mindset work. Is that something that you sort of just developed on your own accord from being more mindful over the years, or have you taken some sort of training specific to rewiring fearful
Right.
um,
Well, I
inner
mean, I
dialogue?
definitely, yeah, I mean, I have had trainings, and I think this idea gets expressed in lots of different places. So it's not a new idea. Lots of different people talk about it. When I started seeing the successes I was having for myself, just implementing mindfulness practices, I did start getting some additional training on mindfulness, how to bring mindfulness into any kind of setting. So I took and got certified in Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute's mindfulness training. And what I loved about that training is it provided a lot of research on, like what's actually happening. So it was a very science-based approach to mindfulness, which for education settings is important. Because we always want to make sure that we keep religion and spirituality out of school settings. And there's plenty of research that shows that these mindfulness practices and what's happening in our brains and in our bodies can be measured. And there's a good, often physiological explanation for it. So I was doing my own research, but at the same time, I was going through this course where I was talking with other people all the time about the research, which really helped me to connect some of the things that maybe I was starting to do intuitively with the rationale behind why it worked. And for me, that worked really well. So understanding about like neuroplasticity, and that actually our thought patterns are like roads. And the more you think that thought, the deeper the rut in that road becomes. But that actually we can create new roads. And when we create new roads by changing our thought patterns, such as for me, changing this thought pattern that if I speak out loud, I'm going to somehow be harmed in some way, lose my job or lose relationships, to actually I can speak my truth in a way that's open and clear and collaborative. That's the new pathway that I started to build, and it takes time, but now that's the one that I feel much more confident in. The old path is there sometimes, and, and I find myself down that road, but I know it, and I know how to redirect myself to the new pathway. And knowing that that's what's happening helps me, and is what I often share with others, because yeah, I think it's hard to take we want to have some kind of proof that what we're going to do is going to work, and to go on faith alone is hard, especially if we're integrating it into a high stakes space like education, where really as educators, we often feel like we don't have a moment to spare, and we don't have that permission to do that kind of work. Knowing that it's actually effective, I think helps to keep people going and get them started for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great description that, you still have that road, but you just don't probably go as far down it as you once did. It's much
Right.
easier to course correct. So I mean, I'm all about the science too. I'm obsessed with the science of it, but I'm also big into the woo, if you will. I loved at the beginning of the conversation how you talked about, you noticed, like, on the one hand, when you were doing a mindful practice, how you were showing up, but also how that impacted how the other person behaved. Can you speak a little bit more about that in terms of, I mean, from my perspective, there's like there's a scientific explanation in terms of how the energy interacts between people. But I'm curious more in terms of your experiential viewpoint. How does that help?
Yeah. Well, and I have plenty of woo too. So just to say, like, I try and restrain it when we talk about education, but I think that's there, and that's also really rich. So I just want to acknowledge that. So let's use the believing eyes as an example, because that's one of the things that I started to shift towards. So I found myself in a lot of really tense, I was a district office, like senior leader, which meant that I held things that impacted the whole school district. And again, mine were the change ones, which meant that they came with a lot of stress, not only for the school communities that I was working with, but also the people that supervise those school communities or that provided services to those school communities. So when I would walk into a space, I represented changes for many different people all the time. And I've always worked on having a positive relationship with the people that I was with. And so I think I always had good relationships. But when we'd get to these moments where a change needed to happen, or I needed to give them some feedback or kind of push back a little bit on something that we were doing, I noticed that those really positive relationships would fall away quickly and suddenly become replaced with kind of aggressive energy that was hurtful for me, and also certainly wasn't productive. So I started just being the believing eyes for those folks in particular, and not in a manipulative way, but in a like, I need to change my relationship with them and how I see them, so that I can be more effective with them. And so I just started getting to know them a little bit and celebrating them. So there's always really great things to celebrate about anyone if you look for it. So I started looking for things that I really appreciated about the people that I was working with, especially the ones that are a little bit harder for me at the moment. I'm like, what's this person doing really well that I can focus my attention on, and I can also let them know that I'm seeing in them. So I started doing that a lot. I started just asking them about their lives, and being curious and being excited for them when they got to success. There's a lot of competition in district central offices, and in the world, but in schools possibly too. But in district central offices, there's a lot of like jockeying for power and position. And so I started just removing myself from that, and celebrating folks when they were getting it. And what happened was people's affective filters dropped a lot. They were much more able to talk with me when they felt like they were being seen, and they felt like I really was invested in their success. And so it just shifted the nature of our conversations a lot, and allowed us to get a lot farther, a lot faster, because they felt seen in that way. The unexpected dividend I got was that when things started getting hard for me, they noticed, in a way that hadn't happened before. So if I was pulling myself back a little bit energetically because I was having a hard day, or there was a stressful meeting or situation, then those people would spontaneously start to connect back in with me, and they would notice how I was feeling, or they would start to give me positive feedback around something that I had done in a meeting that they felt was really impactful. So I started getting it back. It wasn't my intention, but it helped. And so I think it's just little things that can really start to make a big difference.
Wow, I think that's all really rich advice for any leadership situation in the industry, really. So how can people connect with you? Tell us more about the book and what's the best way to reach you.
Yeah. So the book, in really brief terms, is called An Educator's Guide for Using Your Three Eyes. The three eyes are intellect. It's kind of what we've been talking about today. So it's our reasoning, thinking; insight, which is perspective taking and emotional intelligence; and then intuition, which is actually learning how to get out of our head brains and into our bodies and listen to some of that innate knowledge that we already have within us. And basically learning how to triangulate between those three data sources to make decisions and move through the world. And I talk about how to do that in our personal lives as well as in educational settings. So I give real life examples for teachers and school leaders around that. The best way to connect with me is to go to my website, which has the same name, which is www.your3eyes.com. YOUR3 EYES.com. And you can find Your Three Eyes on Facebook and on Instagram and Twitter. I also host a podcast with another educator specifically focused on issues around education called The Awakening Educator. Lots of spiritual stuff in there too. So those are some ways to find me and to connect. And I'm offering some free courses this summer around getting ready for the school year, with integrating social emotional learning into the school year. So that's coming, and those are free this summer for anybody who wants to do it. And if you go to the website, you'll find all of that.
Wow, amazing. You'll have to pass me the link for the podcast, because I am surrounded by educators. My mom's retired, and her husband, my sister-in-law, I don't know, I grew up with, obviously, pretty much all of my mom's dearest friends are teachers or former teachers. And I don't know, I always loved school and had some really special teachers throughout my education. And I commend you for all the work you're doing and sort of going the quote unquote boring financial route. But in the end, you've come back full circle really to bringing spirituality on a scientific level back into education and leadership. So congratulations on all your work.
No, thank you. And thanks for having me on the show. It's been really fun to talk about this with you.
Well, like I said, we'll share everything, all the links in the show notes. And the book they can find only through the link, or is it available on somewhere else?
Oh, it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, the usual places where you can buy books. So that's the best place to go for the books itself. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us and the little exercises. I love the three breaths. I mean, that is really applicable to anyone in any. I feel like everyone should start doing that practice because it's, like you said, a micro practice. There's really no excuse that you don't have time to do that, but it could really be transformational in your relationships and your work culture, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Megan. We'll be in touch.
Thank you, Megan. Okay.